There are two sorts of respondents. There's the expert sort who can comment on the papers magisterially, apparently what I'm supposed to do. Then there is the ignorant sort, the innocent abroad, innocent enough to agree to stand up at the end of a meeting of experts and actually declare his innocence at length, who can make the speakers feel their own expertise to the full by exposing his own lack of it. I'm clearly of this second sort with much more to learn than to teach, and I will thus try to avoid presuming to tell each of you what I think you should have said, since you all know not only your own fields, but the larger field of Renaissance religious studies better than I do. My role here is nonetheless to play the part of second bookend, along with the three panelists who follow me. First bookend was Peter, in his own clearly magisterial opening paper, which set out both an agenda for this conference and a demonstration of certain ways this agenda might be realized by his way of his work on 15th century sermons. It was a wonderful exfoliation of what we're here to do. Both there and in his various communications to the speakers over the past year and a half, Peter has laid out an ambitious vision of our joint enterprise as speaking back to and perhaps moving away from the 1972 conference on the pursuit of holiness, inspired both positively and negatively by a more recent conference I didn't know about until recently on the Medici in 2010. Now, in speaking, as Peter told us, about the Medici, it was possible to consider the church as a political institution, but religion did not feature largely in this account of 15th century Florence, and the hiatus was thought to be significant enough that an event of the present kind was called for. And I like the fact that it was called for from the floor. This is a bottom-up conference. Now, in the planning of it, this event became not only an event featuring 12 papers on the topic of Renaissance religion that we've heard, and the 12 or so to come next year at Religions 2 in Bologna, but quite strikingly to me, a conference that would ask large methodological questions about the study of religion as it pertains to the wider field of Renaissance studies. Now, I don't really know why this was, since I'm an ignorant, innocent outsider, but it is as though the study of Renaissance religion might still be in need of self-conscious exploration, explanation, and perhaps justification. In a sense, I'm exactly the wrong person to do this. I'll start apologizing quite soon. Since this is not my field, nor is social history my discipline, I'm an intellectual and literary historian who works with what in this context might be called normative religious texts, Latin and vernacular, from the period 1000 to 1500 or so, and tries to understand their interrelationship and their various changing and continuing historical and cultural functions, including what Sabrina Corbellini called their transformative functions, their aspiration to inform and shape the lives of individuals and communities. So although I can understand it, I can't, for example, share, really even for a moment, in scholarly perspectives that argue against our taking texts too seriously, to paraphrase crudely one of Nick's closing remarks yesterday, a social historian's remark, as it were, or that would view episcopal visitation records, rich and wonderful as they are, as providing an ipso facto better account of how the late medieval secular church worked than the sort of pastoral documents that outline or seek to rectify lay and clerical ignorance. I'm just not wired that way. Religious texts, primarily normative texts, and the idea they contain just are at the center of my intellectual universe, and my remarks need to be heard suspiciously with this fact in mind. In fact, I'm going to be saying to everybody, just do more of the sort of thing that I do. I think it's probably what it boils down to, which is actually really, really bad. So don't take it seriously. Thus, to get to the most eminent examples of various bafflements I've felt over the last 2 days, the distinction that's often been drawn here between the church and religion or religions is incomprehensible to me. I can, of course, grasp the work it's trying to do. I'm not a complete dumbo. Viz., to detach the study of Christianity from the study of specific ecclesiastical institutions or buildings, to make a space for attention to religious practice, especially lay, or what is still in some spaces called popular practice, though I very much dislike this term, popular. All well and good. But from my own disciplinary perspective as an intellectual religious historian, to push this distinction between the church and religion is problematic in two ways. First, It suggests that even if it's defined in the broadest possible way, Christian religious practice in the medieval and Renaissance period could take place with no reference to religious institutions. A dubious assertion about a religious system that defines membership so fiercely around baptism, participation in the Eucharist, and the internalization of catechesis, whether or not these things were observed. Second, and perhaps more serious, this church-religion distinction attributes to the church at this period a multiple, segmented, and deeply disorganized body, not to be equated with any single institutional viewpoint, a level of coherence and mastery that would hardly have been understood at the time except in a very few fiercely reformist contexts. It's to identify the church either with the hyper-clericalized pontifical imagining bodied forth by Pius II at Pienza that Siebler was talking wonderfully about to us this morning, or, perhaps more powerfully, with anti-clerical opponents of precisely these imaginings, the people who say the church is really the Antichrist from the late 14th century on. The nature of the church, what a church the church was hotly contested throughout this period, never purely along confessional lines. For me to announce that church and religion as separable entities is to take a theological position, and what is more, a relatively rarefied and extreme theological position, that of radical reform or counter-reform. So I don't think we should do it. Now, more on this a bit later in these remarks, which move quite far from the conference itself to reflect more widely on the topic of methodology in the historical study of religion, and then proceed rather briefly to the difficult task of trying to abstract some generalizations from the very interesting papers we've heard over the past 2 days. I found them all fascinating in their focus on specific archives and historical approaches and in the new knowledge they offer us. I didn't know about votive tablets, 15th century and 16th century church-building protocols, the generating of Jewish conversion, Cistercians acting as civic treasurers, and a whole lot else besides. And I suspect I'm not the only person who didn't, actually. But I've also found the papers, at least initially, intriguingly resistant to the kinds of theorizing of their own methodology, the ambitious talking back to an earlier scholarly moment that Peter asked of them. This really is not a criticism, but an observation, a tentative observation at that. In a sense, the main thing that seems, from my viewpoint, to hold the papers together is their joint but essentially pragmatic awareness of the richness of many different kinds of archive in this field, and the need to know them all much better than we do at present. So perhaps we're at a scholarly moment that is resistant to methodological definition, perhaps pragmatic eclecticism, interdisciplinary but also micro-disciplinary, focused on the local, not the general, is the current order of the day. Now, there's quite a lot to think about here already, and I'm eager to hear if people agree with this characterization of the papers as a whole as pragmatic and particularist, or if I'm simply missing something, and it's very likely that I am. I do think that the dominant paradigms that I've been hearing about are closer to social history to the kind of history I do, and so I think my ear may be a tin one in some of these respects. But just on the supposition that I may be partly right, let me here veer to the opposite extreme and generalize as broadly as I can before offering a theoretical template that somewhat coincides with, somewhat challenges what we've heard these past couple of days. So starting with the by now quite well-traveled ground of thinking about the pursuit of holiness and the religious turn in historical studies and in Renaissance studies associated through the 70s and beyond with Clifford Geertz. So a startling thought came to my mind in rereading The Pursuit of Holiness and revisiting Geertz as I prepared for this conference. This is that the topic of Christianity, at least in the Anglophone world, I'm not sure elsewhere, is still something of a pariah in the historical and social disciplines. Whatever religious turns there have been, the topic of Christianity has been and perhaps remains almost too hot to handle for a Western secular academy that spent a good deal of the 19th and 20th centuries trying to work out how to think about history, ethics, literature, society, the self, and human meaning outside the categories established by Christianity during its millennium and more of European and later American intellectual dominance. To remember the scholarly origin story that surrounds the term Renaissance, made canonical by a lapsed Swiss Lutheran in the 1860s, that's Jakob Burckhardt, of course, or that of the discipline of sociology founded in the early 1900s by a German Calvinist, that's Max Weber, who identified the origins of modern society with the secularization of religious ideals supposedly made possible by the Protestant Reformation. To remember those origin stories is to be reminded how our modern disciplinary formations both emerge from and continually struggle with a Christian past and a still partly Christian present, whose transcendent terms they will not acknowledge, but the ghosts of whose influence will keep returning over and over again. Extraordinary measures have to be adopted, and still are adopted, to try to keep these Christian ghosts quiet. They just will not shut up. To establish a properly secular scholarly discourse in the human sciences. I don't think this is an easy situation in any field. You scratch a social science discipline, you get Christian theology over and over again. It's a particularly difficult situation in the field of European history, and it's an excruciatingly difficult one in the field of religious history, because that's what we're supposed to be thinking about, especially the branch of religious history that concerns itself with the period most commonly associated with the advent of that secular fiction we call modernity itself. So you can see something of this agony of secularization in the way that the pursuit of holiness almost uniformly turns its back on the field of church history as it's been practiced since the 16th century, by carefully enclosing and so subduing the central event of the early 16th century Reformation within the new chronological bands that it sets, proposing a new periodization that stretches from nominalism in the mid-14th century to the early Enlightenment, sometime in the early 17th century. That's the time frame that the pursuit of holiness very innovatively pronounces, gathering together medievalists and Renaissance scholars for that purpose. It's a time frame that carefully avoids scholasticism, high scholasticism of the 13th century, which has a filthier reputation in the early 1970s, and a slightly better one, but only a slightly better one now. And indeed, the only person who's really cruelly treated in the volume is the great scholar of 13th century pastoral thought, Leonard Boyle, Father Leonard Boyle, who is so meanly and roughly handled. It's very fascinating. It's a wonderful ironic vision, mostly, of how scholarship might work, but not in that one place. Now, this 1350 to 1650 periodization was fashionable at that time, and the great scholar, I think, of this periodization was the religious historian John Bossy. And it's still in use in a scholar I was sort of hoping would be mentioned here and hasn't been, the German scholar Bernd Hahn, whose notion of normative centering, as he calls it, is his kind of universal notion for thinking about what happens in Christian thought between 1350 and 1550 or 1600, I think could be very useful. Now, these dates may not have occurred to some of you here as odd, because they work if you're thinking about the Italian Renaissance. They work quite well. But in a European context, particularly a religious context, they represent a radical departure from confessional traditions that have dominated historical work on 16th century Christianity, in which traditions, what Luther was thinking in different months of 1516 or 1517, or what the Council of Trent decided in each of its long drawn-out sittings, have been objects of separate and fascinated analysis. So the impulse in this periodization was presumably precisely to hobble the confessional impulse and the emphasis on confessionalism in religious history. Perhaps that was praiseworthy. I think it probably was. But understandable though this impulse may have been, these dates, this periodization, at least in the pursuit of holiness, also made it extraordinarily hard to focus in detail on issues of thought and, I'm going to say it, doctrine. That is, on the ideals, debates, ideas, dialogues, and norms in play across the period, and the impacts they may have had or did have on individuals, communities, and the shaping of politics and works of art. This is true even in the apparently more traditional contributions to the volume by intellectual historians such as Heiko Obermann and Charles Trinkhaus as editors, who use their accounts respectively of 14th century nominalism and early 15th century humanism not to explore the complex thought systems these movements represent, but rather to drive a wedge between the supposedly ossified normative institutional thought of the period and the new proto-modern appeal to what they imply was the new category of experience. The great key word of this volume is experience. Which in the academic cultures of the early 1970s, naturally enough, seemed the very quintessence of the contemporary. What else was the early 1970s about, if not experience? So having reduced 2 centuries of religious turmoil to a single term, experience, in this way, Obermann, with accustomed bravado as well as learning, is able to describe the Reformation astonishingly as an almost imperceptible process. Think of that, the Reformation's almost imperceptible process. It's really difficult to put yourself in a situation where that phrase makes sense as an account of the Reformation. It comes up several times in the book. So it's not surprising then that the book's social historians, who are the kind of god and goddess of this particular event, such as Natalie Zeman Davis, allow themselves to treat the theological systems in play across the period as merely the concerns of an intellectual elite whose dominance in previous scholarship had to be done away with before anything of real interest could be said about religion as a cultural system. Religion as a cultural system thus enters the scholarly picture already in opposition to religion as a system of thought, with the word symbol, horrible word, doing, at least in this context, doing many kinds of duty to fill in the gaps that emerge. Symbol does massive work. Hence, one source, I suppose, of the desire here to make church and religion into different categories, which I've already pointed to. Now, Peter noted this same feature of Natalie Zeman Davis's approach in his introduction yesterday, which also showed, against Davis's approach, how engaged actual 15th century Italian lay people could be in the propositional content of even the most abstract-seeming sermons, offering us an important object lesson in the limitations of the idea of a popular religion fully detached from high intellectual culture. So I agree with those who consider Davis's invocation of Geertz, who approaches the subject of religion from within the universalizing framework of mid-20th century ethnographic anthropology, that this invocation of Geertz is at once important in its own right and a harbinger of one of the ensuing religious turns, the religious turn that also includes people like Peter Brown, the ancient historian. I also agree that this turn has been and perhaps continues to be immensely productive. But I will say that I see the conscientious shift away from the study of Christian history on versions of its own terms that the use of Geertz's paradigm enables. Its abstraction of local detail in favor of supposedly transcultural categories such as purity, taboo, and symbol as a disciplinary and perhaps a cultural disaster. The intention of the Geertzian turn was to bring us closer to the European Christian past and its people, by enabling a fierce and democratizing focus on practice, uncluttered by the normative categories of the period. Its effect, I submit, has been to render many of these practices incomprehensible, except as examples of general principles at work in the quasi-universal field of culture. An intellectual elite ourselves, we have tried to reappropriate religious history to our own purposes by refusing the categories used to describe it by the clerics who are our most obvious predecessors. This seems at best a tragic procedure, the mark of a great wound in the European imaginary. Now, what does any of this have to do with our conference? Actually, less and less as I go, but I'll try. I want to suggest briefly that many of our difficulties in framing the study of Christianity in thinking about the medieval or Renaissance past, in Italy or elsewhere, derives from our continuing uneasiness in using directly or thinking too hard about normative Christian categories. I want further to suggest that these categories, as a matter of course, provide much of the best language with which to explore how Christian culture worked. Because Christian thought, though not unified, is not really divisible. Any instantiation of something within the Christian paradigm, I think, invokes the whole structure of Christian thought in some way. It's like the DNA travels around with it. So I'll focus here very briefly on three examples, interlocking examples. One, the category of the church, how Christian thought understands the category of the church. A second, the category of the secular, a word that we need to remember derives from a religious word for time and the world of the non-transcendent, saeculum. Secular is a religious concept. The idea of the secular is only possible if you can inhabit a religious viewpoint, at least before modernity, possibly still. And the third of the things I want to bring in here bears on the very interesting plural that Peter and Nicholas introduced into the title of this conference, religions, and which seems to have gone quite little remarked. So my basic point is that Christianity is not and never has been a system or an institution with a fixed identity. On the contrary, it's always been more like an endless but intimate family quarrel, aggressive, impossible ever to end, at times quite interestingly self-critical, not susceptible of any sort of full explication, even by the parties engaged on it, whose cousin was it who went off with him, let alone by outsiders, but still only possible to describe using its own immensely complicated and historically contingent categories. Family quarrel is my motif, really, for how Christian thought can only be thought about from the inside. So the church, what and where is the church? Is the church primarily the Church of St. Peter and its secular hierarchy? Is it monasticism, with its old claim to represent the primitive church of the book of Acts? Monasticism claimed that laicization was a concession to the frailty of the secular. Is the church the whole community of the baptized? Or is it the secret company of the elect? Those whom God, and perhaps only God, knows will one day belong to the true church, which is that in heaven. I could be wrong, but I think I may have said God for the first time in this conference. But people tell me how wrong I am. I think I might just have done that. In a normatively Christian society, where non-members are relatively rare and usually persecuted, but who, in the case of the Jews at least, still play a vital part in the religious mythos, does the church have an outside? That is, can the church be understood as distinct from society? How many positions on these sorts of questions are tolerated by those with political or religious power at any given time and place? That is, how many religions is it possible to live with, given the constraints of a particular cultural moment? How complex is the family quarrel at a given historical period? So to observe shifts in the answers to these questions, or in the balance of the answers to these questions, is to observe religious change, the specific sort of change that is religious change in action. Religious change is always change within continuity if the religion is based on what it calls the deposit of faith, the depositum fidei. Often, the change itself takes place under the banner of a distinctive and vital ecclesiological and personal category, the category of reform. Of course, a backward-looking word, reform. A product of the church's grounding in a set of normative self-expectations whose very resistance to change makes them continuously subject to reinterpretation, as the ideal past and the body of authoritative texts and monuments that represent it are used to critique and, where possible, alter the present. Reform is a continuous cyclic process. Now, these questions of what is the church, what is secular society, and so on, of course, come into a particularly important crisis at the time of the Reformation. Although they've been in crisis, crisis really is the condition of their existence for many centuries beforehand. In this context, I particularly enjoyed Giorgio's account of how several preachers in the 1540s and 50s entered their own nuanced answers to questions like what is the church, what is prayer, and so on, but then had to find them pushed into one camp or another as the Reformation created the kinds of bifurcations that we now identify as Christian. We identify Christian with bifurcated views of what Christianity is rather than with multiple views. So I'm not quite sure, as I told Giorgio, about the role of dissimulation in this, but I'm sure that the nuance of the accounts, of the positions that these preachers were taking is an important part of the story. Now, one thing we've definitely learned, again in the last couple of days, is that this is not merely to talk about religion through the categories of religion, of Christianity, is not merely to make an elite approach to the actual phenomena, social, artistic, and communitarian of medieval and Renaissance Christian history. And I'm making here a historical claim, not a methodological one. On the contrary, work on the late medieval and early modern laity has shown increasingly, certainly for Northern Europe and clearly now for Italy as well, the sophistication of materials written for, by, or about those that clerical discourse continue to call the illiterate, laymen and lay, semi-religious and often religious women. It's very clear for the 14th and 15th and 16th centuries that the laity were in massive and important ways fully engaged in the project of the Christian church, the forward-thinking project of the Christian church. And my strong belief is that this is true for earlier centuries as well, and that will become clearer and clearer, going back as far as I can go, which is about the 8th century, where things like our judgment about literacy rates, the nature of lay involvement in the church, the nature of theological pluralism are becoming massively enriched by early medievalists. So at this conference, we've seen lay people participating in the educational and spiritual project of Christian thought and practice at the highest level on several occasions. And I do announce this, as it were, as one of the major themes, I think, of the conference that we've just been participating in. So Jane's paper on the Spedali della Scala and the production and partial effacement of the Tobit cycle that she argues was there on the walls at one point, and was just a little bit of it was left behind when it was replaced by a different kind of imaginary set of murals. So this is a sophisticated argument that's taking place on the walls of the Spedali, perhaps with the artist at the center of the argument, over the relationship between the corporal works of mercy, which is what the hospital is there to carry out, and which often carry them with the injunction to do your good works in secret, and the needs of a civic society where charitable display is understood as honorable, and where charity is non-dispensable part of how a city operates. It is the welfare system. It is how you get by as a community, by encouraging the rich to give, and to give ostentatiously, like the Pharisees, or like whoever, if necessary. It's a sophisticated religious and ethical argument that's carried out on the walls there by artists. That's one example, I think, of the kind of sophistication of lay responses at this period. Leslie Hansenokak's paper, too, on ecclesiastical visitations, I thought was suggestive in this respect. In its demonstration that lay people seem capable of making their own ethical as well as practical judgments about their clergy, about particularly the question of clerical concubinage or maybe secret marriage, and that such judgments were received in the context of visitations with at least a certain degree of respect. And now we can look at this as an example of the church kind of going boccaccio all the time and behaving in ways susceptible of satire. Or we can look at it as a negotiation between different models within Christian thought, including ancient models that proclaimed the usefulness of a married clerisy, ancient models which are still very much alive in all kinds of corners of the Christian church today. Another example, of course, is Peter's vision of 15th century Florentine merchants listening carefully to expositions of the hierarchic thought of Dionysius the Areopagite, or Sabrina Corbellini's account of the Zibaldoni. Now here, with the Zibaldoni, I want to make a suggestion that we're most in need of real, solid detail. An account of the range of texts and excerpts of texts, the theological, social, and ethical views they suggest, how they represent themselves to their readers, and so on. And I'm not criticizing Sabrina for not having provided this, because it's at early stages of a project presented to us in 20 minutes. But that's what we're going to need, because here's one of the ways we're going to be able to find out how many different Renaissance religions the lay, mostly probably privileged, mostly probably male, but not necessarily, I don't know, householders actually represented and inhabited religions, versions of Christian thought, almost certainly at war with one another on various levels. They almost certainly don't agree about the intercession of the saints. They almost certainly don't agree about the veneration of images and other hot topics of the 15th and 16th centuries. We're also going to need to know at some point whether these same households that produce Sibildoni are the ones that offer votive tablets. Does Mary Lavin's suggestion that the Renaissance lay households wanted their religion gentle and kind as the mercy of the saints continue to check out when we consider that some of these households were reading maybe different kinds of texts or going to different kinds of sermons? So if you imagine a votive tablet offered by someone who's just listened to a sermon on Pseudo-Dionysius with great care, does that change how we use the evidence of the votive tablet? I think that it might. Now, these are not questions that are going to respond well to comparative ethnography. They're not going to respond well to any kind of methodology that uses the term culture as its keyword. The term culture as its keyword is damaging in this context, nor is a big data approach, another fashionable, newly fashionable approach in literary studies, going to be helpful here, although, of course, having everything on databases and being able to word search is always helpful. So actual work, hard work with the thought worlds of the texts is required, and now I'm glad to say, by the sound of it, is increasingly in progress. I do think that the search for detail that I did say at the beginning was perhaps a non-theorized part of the project here might actually turn out to be very compatible with the thing I'm suggesting. And finally, just on a point that was raised in relation to Sabrina's talk, of course it's so often been the case that these vernacular texts in Italian, and certainly I know in Middle English, are called simple and plain and basic by scholars. And one of the reasons that they're called that is that they call themselves that. They continually call themselves that. The reason they call themselves that is that plainness and simplicity are ideals in the spiritual culture of the time. That the laity have as one of their great claims to centrality, to one definition of the late medieval and early Renaissance Christian church, the fact that they can inhabit plain simplicity in ways that university-educated clerics such as ourselves cannot. That's simplicity and plainness is, again, in play within this discussion. So now I just come to a very few scattered observations, and then I should stop and let other people speak. The question of the church and the household has been raised, very interestingly. And the sacred household isn't a Renaissance phenomenon, nor is it a Protestant phenomenon, because the household, of course, is one of the key core definitions of the Christian church. The household is the church in the book of Acts, particularly. When conversion takes place in the book of Acts, it's the male householder, usually, often, who is converted along with his whole household. And the household, of course, is an extended public institution, characteristically in the book of Acts with slaves. In the later medieval and Renaissance period, not with slaves, but with a great number of servants. In late 14th and 15th century English cities, householders, these are mostly merchants and artisans who are guildsmen citizens, are formally charged by the polity with spiritual governance over their household members. They can conduct the visitation of the sick, they conduct various kinds of pastoral care, they're responsible for catechesis, they're already responsible for catechesis in the 13th century. So the household is, I don't know if it's sacred or not, but it's part of the church in earlier models too. And finally, the church and civic society. So there are wonderful accounts we've heard of the many different civic and religious identities it was possible to inhabit. Nick mentioned identities as a key theme yesterday. The changes between these identities, medial identities and that kind of thing. So Francis Andrews gave us an account of this via the Viri Religiosi and how they held down civic offices in 14th and 15th century Florence and elsewhere. And in a different but interesting related vein, Tamar spoke of degrees of conversion and coercion in the baptism of male and female Jews and the kinds of complex identities that Jews had after conversion. Now, in Francis's account, I found especially interesting the category of trust, because this category really belongs to the community. It's an ethical value bound up in civic society whose relation to Christian structures is indeterminate and purposefully so. Trust is not exactly a Christian category. It seems to belong to secular society. On the whole, I think there really isn't outside to medieval and Renaissance Christianities, even locally, areas of civic and intellectual life that medieval Christianities are happy to understand as not exactly within their ambit, even as they interact with it. This is because Christianity understood that there was a non-transcendent as well as a transcendent reality. And I found that Valentina's account of Lucretius, the circulation of Lucretius, gave a especially fascinating example of this. Lucretius's philosophical moralism has obvious resonances and uses within the framework of Christian thought and practice, which, after all, makes much use of the idea of the death of the body, the end of all things earthly, and so on. But his anti-transcendentalism is a problem, not least because it's so moving. Thus, distinctions have to be invoked. The text has to be censored in certain contexts. To conclude very awkwardly here, so I think that in some ways the papers show the possibility of, and I think that many of them show the desirability of, a new turn in the study of medieval and Renaissance religion, and that this would be a theological turn. It would be a turn to use the thought system, the complex, muddy thought system that's called Christianity, as a template with which to read the enormous plurality of local phenomena with which scholars are now concerned. Work on Christian history requires knowledge of the intimate and complex workings of Christian thought. Otherwise, when detailed work moves out towards the general, says this is an example of X, the general that's moved out towards is crude, confessional or anti-confessional, and does not have the sophistication and flexibility of Christian thought systems themselves. I know this is the suggestion that an intellectual historian would make to a company of social historians and others, but I propose it to you nonetheless. Thank you.